modern pursuit of psychological stability, the ultimate objective is frequently defined as a life entirely devoid of crisis. When an organism achieves complete environmental safety, a stable career, a predictable routine, an absence of acute trauma, the anticipated neurological response is profound contentment. Yet, clinical observation reveals a deeply unsettling phenomenon. The attainment of good enough frequently triggers an agonizing, unexplainable psychological void. Society instantly pathologizes this emptiness as a moral defect. The individual is aggressively labeled as ungrateful, restless, or perpetually dissatisfied with their reality. However, an objective examination of this psychological state reveals that the despair of the baseline is never a failure of character. It is a strict biological equation. The human nervous system did not evolve for static comfort. It evolved for dynamic adaptation. When a highly capable mind is submerged in an environment of total predictability, it is systematically deprived of the friction required for structural growth. The resulting emptiness is not a psychological flaw. It is baseline stagnation. It is the slow, silent, neurological starvation of an organism that has successfully survived the storm, only to find itself suffocating in the calm. The dopamine flatline. To diagnose the emptiness of a normal life, we must first understand the true biological function of motivation. In popular culture, dopamine is routinely celebrated as the molecule of pleasure. Clinically, however, dopamine is the molecule of anticipation. Its primary evolutionary purpose is to track the discrepancy between what we expect and what we actually achieve. When an ordinary individual is struggling to establish a life, fighting to secure a job, find an affordable apartment, or stabilize a routine, the brain is highly engaged. The gap between current reality and survival safety is wide, causing dopamine to surge with every small victory. But when that safety is finally achieved and every single day looks exactly like the one that preceded it, the gap closes to zero. The brain enters a state of absolute predictability. Without a variance to calculate, the dopamine pathways simply flatline, turning the peace you fought so hard to achieve into a gray, featureless landscape. The luxury of trivial misery. When the nervous system is starved of genuine structural friction, it does not slip into peaceful relaxation. It is a biological law that an understimulated brain will always manufacture its own turbulence. Without real threats to navigate, such as acute scarcity, immediate danger, or systemic instability, the mind begins to shift its immense computational power onto the mundane. It alters its scale of perception. Suddenly, minor workplace politics, a slight delay in a daily commute, or a microscopic disagreement with a partner are amplified into catastrophic events. The individual experiences the full physiological cascade of a survival threat: racing heart, cortisol spikes, chronic anxiety over completely trivial inconveniences. This is the tragic coping mechanism of a stagnant mind. It creates artificial ghosts just to give the nervous system something to fight. The ghost in the suburbs. This internal escalation culminates in a profound, private isolation. The ordinary individual looks at their life, perhaps a warm home, a safe neighborhood, a functional family, and compares it to the tangible suffering of the wider world. They see global crises, economic devastation, and genuine hardship, and they use those realities to ruthlessly invalidate their own pain. They tell themselves they have no right to be miserable. As a result, the emptiness is forced underground. They cannot confess to their friends or family that their comfortable routine feels like a slow execution, because they dread being told they are simply ungrateful. They are left functioning as a ghost within their own success story, going through the motions of an ordinary life while quietly mourning a vitality they cannot seem to access. Trait 1. Passive consumption cycling. The first behavioral mechanic of baseline stagnation is the transition into passive consumption cycling. When the mind is no longer challenged by the environment, it attempts to artificially stimulate its flatlining dopamine pathways through low-effort consumption. The ordinary individual sinks into an endless loop of digital scrolling, binge watching, or habitual shopping. They are not engaging in these activities out of genuine passion or curiosity. They are utilizing them as a form of cognitive anesthesia. The tragedy of this cycle is hedonic adaptation. The brain adjusts to the hyperstimulation almost instantly. The upgraded phone, the new streaming series, or the modern convenience, food, ceases to provide a chemical lift within hours, leaving the individual surrounded by comfort, yet entirely empty. Trait 2. The paradox of stagnant fatigue. This lack of meaningful engagement triggers the second, more baffling mechanic: the paradox of stagnant fatigue. Millions of individuals in stable, physically undemanding roles return home every evening feeling utterly incapacitated by exhaustion. They pathologize this as a physical illness or a sleep defect. Clinically, however, This fatigue is an energetic downregulation. The human brain operates on a strict policy of resource conservation. When the daily routine requires zero creative problem solving, zero risk, and zero adaptation, the subconscious mind concludes that high energy reserves are no longer necessary. It actively reduces the production of metabolic energy. The individual is not tired because they are doing too much. They are exhausted because they are doing too little. To justify being awake. Trait 3. Temporal escapism, the weekend mirage. This neurological slowdown culminates in temporal escapism, colloquially known as living for the weekend. The entire ordinary existence becomes structured around a countdown to a brief window of perceived freedom. However, when the weekend finally arrives, the mirage dissolves. Because the nervous system is locked in a state of low-grade stagnation, the individual frequently lacks the energetic momentum to actually enjoy their leisure. Saturdays are spent in a catatonic state of recovery, and by Sunday afternoon, a heavy, suffocating anxiety returns. This is not dread for a toxic workplace. It is the subconscious panic of returning to the closed loop. The individual realizes that the time they fought for has slipped through their fingers, leaving them to face another week of identical, unmemorable days. The weaponization of gratitude. When an individual trapped in baseline stagnation attempts to articulate their despair, the surrounding ecosystem rarely responds with empathy. Instead, it deploys a deeply ingrained cultural defense mechanism, the weaponization of gratitude. Society operates on a transactional view of human happiness. If the fundamental requirements of shelter, steady income, and physical safety are met, joy is considered a cultural mandate. Therefore, confessing to a psychological void while possessing a functional life is perceived as a direct insult to the social order. The environment immediately commands the individual to count their blessings, rapidly comparing their emotional flatline to those in genuine, acute crises. Clinically, this intervention is disastrous. Forced gratitude cannot synthesize dopamine in a stagnant nervous system. It merely weaponizes the individual's comfort against them, adding a crushing layer of shame to an already suffocating paralysis. The pathology of the phase. Unable to cure the biological reality of this stagnation, the environment resorts to aggressive categorization. This is the true structural origin of the midlife crisis label. It is a dismissive, socially acceptable category designed to minimize a profound neurological collapse. By labeling the sudden, desperate need for friction as a cliché phase, a temporary bout of depression, or pure irrationality, the environment absolves itself of having to engage with the actual problem. The individual's biological cry for variance, whether it manifests as a sudden desire to abandon a stable career, an uncharacteristic purchase, or a deep craving for isolation, is mocked or heavily medicated. The surrounding system pathologizes the attempt to break the closed loop, utilizing social pressure to force the individual back into the exact identical routine that is starving them. The relational trap. This dynamic ultimately creates severe relational friction. When an individual admits that their perfectly fine existence feels empty, partners and family members frequently process this admission as a direct, personal rejection. The immediate response is often, "Am I not enough? Or is this family not enough?" This specific line of questioning traps the stagnant mind entirely. The biological imperative for environmental friction and new stimuli has absolutely nothing to do with a lack of love or relational devotion. Yet, to protect the fragile egos of those around them, the individual is forced to construct a permanent mask. They must consciously simulate satisfaction, actively pretending that the baseline is fulfilling. This daily simulation demands immense cognitive energy, accelerating the baseline fatigue and ensuring that the individual remains entirely isolated within their own home. The catastrophic urge. When the nervous system reaches the absolute limit of baseline stagnation, it deploys a deeply destructive defense mechanism, the catastrophic urge. A starving brain does not want a subtle shift. It craves a fire. Because the individual has been suffocating in safety for years, their subconscious begins to equate stability with death. Suddenly, the urge to entirely dismantle their life becomes intoxicating. They fantasize about abruptly quitting a stable career, ending a functional marriage, or financially ruining themselves, not out of malice, but out of a desperate, biological hunger for variance. They operate under the fatal illusion that the only way to feel alive again is to plunge themselves back into acute survival mode. This is the tragic origin of profound self-sabotage. The individual burns down their own sanctuary simply to warm themselves by the fire. The principle of engineered friction. To prevent this catastrophic reset, the individual must establish a strict clinical boundary. They must learn the difference between a life that needs to be destroyed and a nervous system that simply needs to be challenged. The antidote to a stagnant baseline is never chaos. It is engineered friction. If the daily routine provides zero physiological resistance, the individual must artificially construct it. They must deliberately step into a domain where they are completely incompetent, where the outcome is entirely uncertain, and where failure is not only possible, but guaranteed. This is not about taking up a casual hobby. It is about aggressively forcing the brain out of its closed loop by subjecting it to the raw, uncomfortable mechanics of learning a genuinely difficult, complex, or physically demanding skill. The brain requires a problem it cannot instantly solve. The decoupling of meaning and comfort. Implementing engineered friction requires a fundamental rewiring of how the ordinary mind perceives success. For decades, the individual has been conditioned to believe that the ultimate goal of life is complete, undisturbed comfort. They must now aggressively decouple meaning from comfort. They must realize that true psychological peace is not the absence of struggle. It is the freedom to consciously choose your struggle. By voluntarily introducing manageable structural difficulty into a perfectly safe life, the individual reactivates the dormant dopamine pathways. The mind is finally allowed to calculate a gap between current ability and a future goal, reigniting the chemical engine of anticipation. They stop being a ghost, haunting their own success story, and become an active architect of their own neurological vitality. The illusion of the escape. When the ordinary individual finally understands the nature of baseline stagnation, a profound shift in perspective occurs. For years, they believed the only cure for their internal emptiness was a radical, geographical, or structural escape. They assumed they needed to completely change their outer world to fix their inner landscape. But the clinical reality is far more grounded. The baseline itself is not the enemy. Safety, predictability, and a quiet routine are extraordinary evolutionary achievements. The error was never the structure of your life. The error was expecting a static environment to fulfill a dynamic nervous system. True recovery does not require you to abandon the comfort you fought so hard to build. It requires you to stop treating that comfort as a final destination and start utilizing it as a secure, well-funded laboratory for voluntary experimentation. The microvariance protocol. This transformation is executed through the microvariance protocol. To wake a flatlined brain, the individual does not need to introduce massive systemic chaos. They must introduce deliberate, small-scale complexity into the cracks of their existing routine. The average mind can be radically shocked out of its dopamine flatline simply by altering the default settings of the day. This means exposing the nervous system to new cognitive friction, learning an entirely unfamiliar language, engaging in physically demanding conditioning that forces deep presence, or pursuing a creative discipline where they have zero natural proficiency. By forcing the brain to process novel, unmapped information within the safety of the baseline, the closed loop is broken. The individual injects a controlled stream of raw vitality directly into the center of a normal, quiet life. The sovereignty of choice. As these small pockets of engineered friction expand, the individual achieves the state of the integrated baseline. The agonizing void of good enough naturally evaporates, replaced by a cold, magnificent clarity. The individual looks at their ordinary life, their standard job, their quiet neighborhood, their repetitive schedule, and no longer sees a slow execution. They see a rare, invaluable luxury. They realize that a stable life provides the ultimate psychological asset, the absolute freedom to choose their own difficulties without the immediate threat of survival panic. The baseline is no longer a cage that suffocates their drive. It is a fortress that protects their growth. They transition from a passive passenger trapped inside a predictable routine into the conscious architect of their own neurological stimulation. The biological verdict. The modern cultural narrative relentlessly insists that if you are not perpetually climbing, changing, or fundamentally restructuring your life, you are failing to live. But biology operates strictly on the unforgiving mathematics of resource conservation. The sudden onset of emptiness within a perfectly fine life is never a character flaw. It is never a sign that you are ungrateful, broken, or incapable of happiness. It is the definitive biological receipt that your environment has become too small for your internal potential. The mind is not asking you to burn down your world. It is simply asking you to give it a problem worth solving. The final absolution. To heal from the despair of the ordinary is not to run away into a life of manic distraction. To heal is to stand within the quiet walls of your baseline, look at the peace you have built, and finally stop apologizing for feeling empty. The numbness was not a defect. It was the undeniable clinical proof that you successfully survived the storm, and your brain was simply waiting for you to decide what to build in the calm. A stable life is not an intellectual dead end. It is the only place where true creation can begin.